She said I didn't belong in my own neighborhood, but by sunset, property records, lawyers, and shocked neighbors revealed a truth that collapsed her authority and exposed everything publicly now. Before starting from beginning, please subscribe. The neighborhood had always sold itself as peaceful, manicured, and exclusive, the kind of place where lawns were measured in inches and mailboxes had to match a predetermined shade of black. It sat tucked behind decorative stone walls and a wrought iron gate that suggested prestige rather than protection. For years, the Homeowners Association had marketed it as a community of standards, not people, though the difference became clearer with time. Moving in had felt like a quiet victory. The house was not just a purchase, but a milestone earned through years of careful planning, disciplined saving, and strategic investment. It stood at the end of a curved street, larger than most, framed by old trees and a long driveway that hinted at privacy. The deed was clean, the taxes paid years in advance, and the property itself was only one part of a broader portfolio that extended well beyond the neighborhood's boundaries. From the first week, the attention had been noticeable. Lingering looks during morning walks, slow-moving golf carts pausing just a second too long, HOA newsletters delivered with handwritten notes reminding residents of obscure rules. None of it was overt enough to confront, but all of it carried weight. The HOA board was known for being aggressive, particularly toward newcomers. They framed their behavior as diligence, but it often drifted into something more personal. One member in particular stood out. She had positioned herself as the unofficial gatekeeper of the community, someone who believed she embodied the neighborhood's identity. She walked with purpose, clipboard always in hand, scanning for violations and, more often, for people she deemed out of place. The confrontation did not begin dramatically. It started with an inspection notice left on the front door, citing vague concerns about residency verification. It escalated with a follow-up letter requesting proof of ownership, framed as a routine audit. The language was sterile, but the implication was anything but neutral. It suggested that presence alone was suspicious. The irony was impossible to ignore. The property in question had been acquired without financing, purchased outright through a legal entity that specialized in real estate holdings. The paperwork existed in layers, meticulously organized and readily accessible. Yet the HOA members seemed confident that the request would be inconvenient, perhaps even intimidating. Neighbors watched quietly as the situation unfolded. Some avoided eye contact, others observed from behind curtains. The community thrived on conformity, and deviation made people uncomfortable. Few wanted to involve themselves, especially when the HOA had a reputation for retaliation through fines and public shaming. The request for verification quickly turned into an accusation dressed up as concern. Additional notices arrived, each one more pointed than the last. They referenced occupancy limits, unapproved tenants, and violations that had no basis in reality. The underlying message was unmistakable. Someone had decided that ownership needed to be proven not because of a policy, but because of a perception. Rather than reacting emotionally, the situation was approached strategically. Every letter was documented, every notice was scanned and cataloged. Dates, times, and delivery methods were logged. The HOA bylaws were reviewed in full, highlighting sections that limited the board's authority. County property records were pulled, cross-referenced, and certified. What the HOA did not realize was that the property they were questioning was the cornerstone of a much larger structure. The house sat on land that had been subdivided years earlier, parcels consolidated under a single ownership umbrella. The total acreage owned within the neighborhood exceeded that of any other resident, including several board members combined. Still, the pressure continued. A formal hearing was scheduled, framed as a necessary step to resolve concerns. The tone suggested that the outcome was predetermined. The assumption was that the resident would either fail to comply or quietly leave, preserving the illusion of control. But the preparation told a different story. Legal counsel was retained not out of fear, but out of principle, not because ownership was in question, but because discrimination was becoming evident.
The HOA's actions had crossed from governance into targeting, and that line mattered. As the hearing date approached, the neighborhood buzzed with speculation. Rumors spread about unauthorized occupancy and imagined loopholes. The HOA member at the center of it all seemed energized, confident that she was defending the community from an intruder. What she did not know was that every step she took was being recorded, not just on paper, but in a legal context that would soon redefine her authority. The meeting loomed, and with it, the moment when assumptions would collide with facts. The neighborhood was about to learn that ownership was not always visible at a glance, and that some foundations ran far deeper than appearances suggested. The stage was set, and the next chapter would not unfold quietly.
The HOA hearing was scheduled for a weekday afternoon, a time chosen deliberately to limit attendance. The meeting room sat inside the community clubhouse, a space usually reserved for holiday potlucks and seasonal decorating committees. That day, it carried a different weight. Folders were stacked neatly on the table, nameplates lined with precision, and the board members wore expressions of rehearsed seriousness. The accusation was framed as procedural, but the atmosphere was anything but neutral. The HOA member who had initiated the process positioned herself as the authority, presenting a timeline of alleged concerns. Her documentation consisted of observation logs and internal notices, all authored by the same hand. The lack of external verification did not seem to trouble her. What followed was not a defense, but a presentation of reality. Certified copies of deeds were introduced, each one stamped and indexed. They traced ownership not just of the house in question, but of adjacent parcels, easements, and shared spaces. The narrative shifted from residency to infrastructure, from suspicion to scale. The board members grew visibly uncomfortable as the scope became clear. The property was not an isolated purchase, but part of a long-term acquisition strategy. The legal entity listed on the deed had been established years earlier, its filings public and unimpeachable. Taxes had been paid in advance, assessments had been overpaid, resulting in credits the HOA had quietly absorbed without question. The realization began to spread that the board had not done its homework. The HOA member who had pushed the accusation sat rigid, her confidence eroding with each page turned. The paperwork did not just confirm ownership, it established dominance within the very structure she believed she controlled. Then came the legal context. A summary of correspondence was presented, highlighting the escalation pattern and the selective enforcement of rules. Comparable properties were identified, none of which had received similar scrutiny. The implication was clear without ever being spoken. This was not about compliance, it was about exclusion. The attorney's presence alone shifted the tone of the room, not a threat, but a reminder of accountability. The HOA bylaws were cited, particularly sections limiting the board's authority to question ownership absent specific triggers. None of those triggers existed here. The board attempted to regain control by suggesting mediation, but the moment had passed. The record was already established. The actions taken were no longer internal matters. They had potential legal consequences that extended beyond fines or reprimands. Outside the meeting room, word began to spread. Neighbors who had stayed silent started to piece together the truth. The narrative they had been fed did not align with the evidence now circulating. The assumption of impropriety collapsed under the weight of documentation. The property owner returned home not in triumph, but in clarity. The neighborhood looked the same, but its power dynamics had shifted. The assumption that had sparked the conflict had been dismantled, replaced by a truth that could not be ignored. Yet one final chapter remained. The consequences of the accusation were still unfolding, and the HOA member who had overstepped was about to learn that authority, once exposed, is difficult to reclaim. In the weeks following the hearing, the neighborhood entered a period of uneasy calm. Lawns were still trimmed and newsletters still arrived, but the tone had changed. The HOA moved cautiously now, aware that its actions were being watched not just by residents, but by external eyes. The board member at the center of the controversy began to withdraw. Her presence at community events diminished. The golf cart remained parked more often than not. When she did appear, she avoided direct interaction. her former confidence replaced by a tight, controlled reserve. Behind the scenes, the consequences deepened. A formal complaint was filed, not as retaliation, but as a record. It outlined the discriminatory nature of the actions taken and cited specific statutes governing fair housing and association governance. The complaint did not demand damages, it demanded reform. The HOA's insurance carrier was notified. Legal counsel advised caution. The board convened emergency sessions to assess exposure. The narrative they had relied on for years, that of absolute authority within the gates, no longer held. Residents began to speak more openly. Stories surfaced of selective enforcement, of assumptions made and privileges extended unevenly. What had once been isolated grievances coalesced into a pattern that was impossible to dismiss. The property owner continued life as usual, unbothered by the shifting perceptions. The house remained a home, not a battleground. The investments continued to grow both within and beyond the neighborhood. Ownership was no longer questioned, but respect was still being recalibrated. Eventually, the HOA member resigned. The announcement was brief, citing personal reasons and a desire to focus on family. The board thanked her for her service and moved on quickly, eager to close the chapter. But the community remembered. New elections followed, bringing in members with a different approach. Transparency became a talking point. Enforcement guidelines were revised and published. The gatekeeping mentality softened, replaced by an understanding that property values were not protected by exclusion, but by equity. The irony lingered. The person accused of not belonging had been one of the most invested stakeholders all along. The assumption that sparked the conflict had revealed more about the accuser than the accused. In the end, no dramatic confrontation was needed. The resolution came through records, policies, and the quiet power of preparation. The neighborhood learned that ownership is not always visible and that authority without accountability is fragile. The story spread beyond the gates, shared as a cautionary tale, not because of scandal, but because of its simplicity. An assumption was made, facts were presented, the truth prevailed. And with that, the chapter closed, leaving behind a community forever changed by the realization that belonging is not granted by perception, but proven by reality.